development. So Brandon, could you start us off by giving us a little bit of an overview of your organization, Amizade, and the work that you do?
Sure. Thank you, Nora. Thanks, Eric, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. As Nora mentioned, my name is Brandon Blache-Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of Amizade Global Service Learning. Amizade is a 21-year-old organization. We're a nonprofit. We're based in Pittsburgh, PA. And simply put, we are organizers of reflective, responsible, and respectful global experience for all people. As a nonprofit, as I think most of you know, we're mandated to not only have a mission statement, but actually work towards meeting that mission. And as an organization, we take that very seriously. So Amizade's mission is to empower individuals and communities through worldwide service and learning. And this is really important. It's also somewhat unique because it means that we're both an extension of our education partners and our communities. This means that in order for us to collaborate, whether that be with a community or a university, we need to imagine how a partnership will benefit both individuals, which might be a student, or and the host community. Okay, so Amizade is not just some weird made-up word. It is the Portuguese word for friendship. We were founded in the Amazon, a place called Santarém, Brazil, in 1994, and we proudly continue to partner there today. Our organization really started as a volunteer vacations organization. We then quickly evolved into a more academically focused global service learning organization. And now we are striving to become what we call a fair trade learning organization. Essentially what this means is we're trying to meet a series of transparent, respectful, and ethically considerate ideals in each of our programs. Today we have a staff of 9 domestically here in the US, and we have over 35 staff around the world. We've been actively working in 12 countries, most of these for over 12 years. To date, we've connected over 9,000 participants in 16 communities. Each year, we collaborate with over 60 education partners. These are most often universities with credit-bearing global service learning programs, a few high schools, a couple of government agencies, including the US State Department, and very excitingly, more and more, we're starting to partner with community groups in neighborhoods. Many of these neighborhoods were once hosting communities, and they're now flipping the script and becoming education partners, and actually they're becoming visiting communities as well. We're globally known for, I would say, probably responsible GSL programming, our safety record, and the development of this thing called fair trade learning. So that's a lot, right? And I'm going to try to summarize this by imagining that we wear 3 hats. Okay. Many of you on this call probably know Amizade as practitioners of global service learning. This is our logistical hat, and it helps develop academic programs for universities and groups. But we also wear what we call our conveners of change hat. So in this way, Amizade tends to act as a long-term development partner of sorts. We bring people together in communities to try to figure out how we can connect in visitors and hosts for some sort of positive social impact. This can look a lot of different ways. So this can look like working on clean water projects with university students and community members in Tanzania, and this can look like building a co-working space for globally engaged organizations, which I'm sitting in right now in Pittsburgh, PA, a place called the Global Switchboard. Finally, the third hat we wear is that we are system changers. And that's what brings me here today to this conversation. As an organization, Amizade recognizes that our size is very small, but our ability to make a difference in the world shouldn't be limited to this. If we can move, for example, the whole international education sector or the whole study sector into a more responsible direction, then our impact can grow and grow and grow significantly. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Brandon, for starting us off with a bit about Amizade. And if we can transition to hear from Jess about Child Family Health International.
Hi, good morning. First, thanks to Nora, Brandon, Eric, and the other presenters, as well as Global SL, for convening this discussion. I am Dr. Jessica Evert. I straddle international education and healthcare. I'm a family physician based in San Francisco. And the reason that I joined CFHI 8 years ago is because I was looking for an organization that I could wholeheartedly believe in. And in part, that wholehearted belief was predicated on an organization that was working from the perspective of humility and of safe and ethical engagement. And in healthcare settings, that's a very specific reality and frame of practice. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. CFHI, so you're aware, has about 30 global health education programs in 10 countries. They're all based on asset-based philosophy, and I think that's crucial for the ethical component. And I'll talk a little bit about how that structure is so important. Next slide here. So why is ethics and program structure so interrelated? When you are talking about highly professionalized settings, such as healthcare settings, whether it's clinical, public health, or community-based health outreach, these are highly professionalized settings where it takes a great deal of education to practice proficiently and to provide the standard of care that we all want to provide to communities worldwide, whether they are resource-rich or resource challenged. And so I think the onion really sums up why this is so important. This spoof is actually speaking of a truism. This is actually happening every day. There are undergraduate medical students, nurses, and other health students that are being given access to community settings where they are practicing healthcare on patients who are particularly vulnerable, who do not understand the level that the student is at and is assuming that the student is wearing a white coat and is coming from abroad and therefore has expertise and is appropriately providing care, when we know that isn't true. And so really how we structure international programs in health-related settings is so critical, and making sure that we have continuity, standards of care in place, safety boundaries around patient care, as well as participant preparation to infuse this ethical framework. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail. Next slide. One of the things I think is really critical in health-related settings is that we set learners up to understand that what determines whether people are healthy or not, in many ways, is determined by what happens outside of hospitals and clinics. In CFHI's 30 programs, we certainly do have clinical healthcare settings involved in many of them, but we really challenge students, faculty, learners, and those who are interested in providing clinical services to think broadly about health. This is a study that was in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was the first to quantify how much of whether someone lives or dies is related to what happens in a hospital or clinic. And you can see that brown piece of the pie there is 10%, and so it's a minority of what determines whether people live or die. So as educators, CFHI feels the onus is on us to provide a program structure that enlightens students, faculty, and university partners to this reality and provides the immersive educational experience so that we are opening minds and hearts as to what is really determining human well-being on the planet. Next slide. So I'll just touch on a few things that I think are key in how we achieve ethical engagement through organizational ethos, program structure, and curricular content. You know, many people talk about the selection process in global education, and I will just say that I think we have to go upstream of the selection process to really talk about how we're even discussing what we're doing. CFHI's motto is "Let the world change you," and this is a really important statement that is challenging traditional paradigms and frames of reference for learners. And so I think it's our messaging upstream of any engagement or application process that is so key to setting the stage as to what students are getting themselves involved in, or the value alignment that's required for our academic partnerships with universities. Another key is that all of our programs occur in the setting of existing health systems. And while this may seem like something to take for granted, we have actually studied this side by side between placing students in existing health systems and placing them in brigades where they're setting up temporary healthcare institutions, clinics, outreach, where they're seeing hundreds of patients a day. And what we found is that when you immerse students in existing health systems, their learning outcomes are very different than when you send them in a brigade type experience. And so it's very important to think about what outcomes you want. And if you want outcomes that include understanding cultural influences of health, understanding public health, understanding community-based medicine and referential healthcare systems, if you want them to understand the actuality and the realities in the anthropological sense, as well as understand the continuity of care that's required for many diseases that are taking lives around the world, then it's important to think about those settings as existing health systems being a critical means to that end. The asset-based engagement is key, and I know many of us on this webinar take this approach, but in our language before students apply to our programs and throughout the programs, we're really showing students strength within low and middle income country settings. And so rather than talking about what resources are lacking, we're talking about what resources exist and how important resourcefulness and passion and community commitment is to achieving improved health status. We also use competency-based curriculum, and again, like that slide with the pie graph I showed you, that's really widening the lens of the learner and university partners beyond clinical practice and hands-on patient care, where so many ethical oversteps can take place. I also see us as being a negotiator between balancing organic community-based curriculum and formal learning objects and objectives. So many of our community-based partners are really teaching students in a very organic sense that can't be captured in structured learning objectives and competencies. So really seeing that the structure of our curricular content in part is honoring the ethos and ethics of fair trade learning principles, which I know Brandon touched on and we'll discuss in more detail. And also framing the student placement as they are global ambassadors for patient safety. This language comes out of University of Minnesota, and by framing this discussion around ethics in the lens of patient safety and community safety, I've found that learners are much more interested in listening, discussing, and embodying these values. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jess. And now, last but not least, we'll transition to hear just a little bit about the organization of Foundation for Sustainable Development before digging in a little bit more to specifically to the video. So Lisa, can you share with us a bit about Foundation for Sustainable Development?
Yes, thank you. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation. Like Brandon and Jessica, I think it's very close, near and dear to our heart as an organization, this conversation about how do we work and what is the ethical implication of our work. Foundation for Sustainable Development was founded 20 years ago, actually. So quite sage to Brandon's Amizade. Our mission is to achieve community-driven goals through asset-based community development and international exchange in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And our vision is we envision a world where we'll have the opportunity to direct economic, social, and environmental resources towards sustainable outcomes that improve the communities. And that vision is deliberately reciprocal or bilateral in that we want people all over the world to have those resources and that opportunity to direct those resources to improve their lives. And that's really to the points that were being made in the video. Could you move to the next slide, please? So in 6 countries with 10 sites around the world, and we are community driven. We work in quite a variety of, we work in health, economic development, youth education, environment, appropriate technology, human rights, gender equity, and a few more things that probably aren't on there. It really is, again, driven by the community's goals. We have 3 basic lines of programs: capacity building with our community partners, grants for the partner projects, and training programs for volunteers. Next slide, please. The community partner piece is really central for us. We have over 250 community partners in our sites. And the goal of all of our work is to support them in executing projects that they believe will be high impact for communities. So we try very hard and to be very deliberately community-centric and have the opportunities for volunteer placements and all the capacity building agenda to be coming directly from our community partners in consultation with the community that they serve. Next slide, please. So our approach, as I said, is an asset-based approach. And we advocate for basically combining three main kinds of assets. The community's assets, so what resources, human and economic and environmental resources are available in the community, as well as the local NGO or community-based organizations assets. And we combine those with volunteer skills, with the goal of creating strong community-based and sustainable projects. So some of the criteria that we have for projects that we will fund and support, that they have to be something will be operated without the volunteers' presence, going forward, and that it can be sustained by the community members themselves over the long term, preferably with some source of revenue to keep it going. And the types of volunteers that we work with are a range of people from, let's call it high school students, through people that are on sabbaticals or retired or on core careers. The bulk of our volunteers are undergraduate university students, but we have a growing cadre of professionals that are beginning to work with us. Next slide, please. So our approach, I think, is a little bit different from the ones that perhaps were in Mr. Mwangi's mind when he was making this statement. We really focus on leveraging community strengths to address pressing issues of the community, and use a sustainable and participatory process for community ownership and project design and implementation, to develop organizational leadership in the community partners. We have local staff that are there year-round and engaging with the community and are from the community themselves. We do offer seed funding and capital investment to support their projects, but we try to make that always complementary to the existing assets that can be mobilized. Partnerships and networking. This is an expanding more and more, is to kind of connect our community partners with others and kind of create affinity groups that are working on the same issues. And then we really, I think what sets us apart is the competency that we have in matching volunteer skills and interest in community organizations, and really match needs and skills.
Thank you, Lisa. So thank you so much, Brandon, Jess, and Lisa, for sharing a bit about the work that your organizations, Amizade, Child Family Health International, and Foundation for Sustainable Development are doing. Focusing a little bit more specifically now on the video, as all of our folks who are joining us here today know, the video is only 6 minutes long, but there is a lot there. And even in calls leading up to this webinar, those of us who were on kind of the panel had different things that jumped out to us as we watched the video. So I thought it would be interesting to share a little bit from the different perspectives. If each of you share, as you watch this video, what jumped out to you the most, and then we can subsequently discuss a little bit how your organization's work may be a response to the critique we hear in the video. So maybe we'll stick with the same order for consistency. Brandon, do you want to start us off and share a little bit about what jumped out to you most as you watched the video?
Sure, yeah. So there were really 6 aspects of this video that popped out to our staff the most. The first is the who. So oftentimes these types of critiques are coming from academics on the left of the political spectrum or isolationists on the right. It has been somewhat rare to see such critiques coming from what could appear to be a little bit more of a mainstream or local opposition to international volunteering. Related, our number 2 observation is that we found it really fascinating that Mr. Mwangi, his critique has grown out of an activist movement for political reform. I share probably the same types of ideas on the political spectrum as he does. Many of our community partners, I'm sure, share his passion and his action for these types of reforms, but they would probably see visitors to their communities very differently. I think our partners see visitors more as allies in advocacy. Three, the false sense of heroism that he and the students in the video speak about is something that we at Amizade have battled with in the past. It's really highlighted by the website. I don't know if you guys have seen this website, and Humanitarian Douchery. You should check it out if you haven't. It was made by some undergraduates in British Columbia. But from our perspective, if there is critical reflection on one's roles and one's place in the world in these types of experiences, international volunteers should be able to break this white savior complex narrative that he and the students are concerned by. Another important idea that jumped out to us was this idea of Africans telling their own story. We absolutely agree. And it's why we believe that we need to ensure these types of experiences are being manufactured more with community voice and less from universities. The idea, 5, that international volunteering benefits the visitor more than the host community also resonates. It's why we've created this idea of fair trade learning. However, we reject any idea of isolation or less engagement being the solution. And instead, we offer ideas of, one, being honest about this process and where our roles can fit in, and what types of help can happen. And 2, figuring out ways to ensure that reciprocity is happening in these programs, and there's also great opportunity for community voice. Finally, we observe that he offers this idea that we are neglecting our issues at home because we're too focused on the rest of the world. In our experience, and I believe, Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the data tends to agree, these volunteer abroad experiences actually tend to get young people more engaged in local issues, not less. And also I would add to that concern for what is global is not inconsistent with concern for local. Individual behavior influences the lives of others on the global-local continuum in ways both seen and unseen.
Great.
Sorry, Brandon, since you practically invited that, I will say that I would disagree, not with what you intended to say, but of course, when we look at the large sector of volunteer programming and all of the things that get passed off as potentially good practice, we see that short-term or sloppy programming can really cement stereotypes or harm communities. But I would agree, absolutely, and the data does show that well-designed, reflective, purposeful global service learning with student learning goals from the outset, put together with community goals with the end in mind, yes, absolutely does all that. And apologies for the nuance, but I know you appreciate the importance of it too.
Well, thank you, Brandon and Eric, for chiming in as well. Before we get too far into discussions back and forth, to hear briefly from both Jess and Lisa about what jumped out most as you watched the video to get us started here. Jess, can you share a few thoughts with us?
Sure. You know, one thing that jumped out to me was the line, the first student who spoke, she said, you know, in response to the question, how do you discover yourself or discover your voice? She responded by saying, I want to advocate for women and travel to India, da, 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 da. And I think that that is a common leap of logic that is really dangerous and is something that as program providers or global health or global education organizations, depending on what school of thought you're in, what you call the organizations that are discussing this, I think we have to be intentional about challenging that leap of logic. It's, you know, advocating for women and traveling to India or Africa or anywhere else are not things that necessarily are a stepwise fashion towards achieving that advocacy. And so I think it's an important call, and I think it's important to call out that leap of logic and to At the same time, I don't, the video also sets up this kind of false dichotomy between addressing backyard wellness issues and seeing the world or struggles worldwide. And I don't think that addressing your own backyard and understanding more of a global perspective through an immersive, well-designed experience are mutually exclusive. And so I think it's kind of a false dichotomy. I do think that there is what I would call a dose response. So in medicine, we talk about dose responses of a drug. So if you give drug A, the response of 5 milligrams is one thing. If you give dose B, or if you give drug B, the response to 5 milligrams is a much bigger outcome. And so the way I see global experiences is that because of the dramatic frame of reference shifting that occurs and the discomfort and the stress response and many things that are psychological, behavioral, and otherwise, that the dose response of an international experience can be much higher than the dose response of a backyard experience. Why is that? Because you are uprooted from your entire frame of reference. You're not sleeping in your own bed at night. You're not able to access the food you're used to accessing. All the basic functioning of life becomes much more difficult, putting you in either a vulnerable place where you're going to get resentful and stress out and freak out, or if supported appropriately, a very open space where you can learn, absorb, and have a complete transformation in your worldview. And that is what we're all hoping for. But as everyone has said, the devil, or the angel, if you are a believer, are in the details. And so the onus is on universities, advisors, and people running programs to really think about those details and not take them for granted. And I'll just close with, speaking from our partners' perspective, Brandon said that his partners consider students to generally be accompaniers or supporters. I will say that we hear very often from our partners that not necessarily obviously CFHI students, because we're setting them up for a different type of experience, but they will recount stories where people are coming to their community in the vein of volunteering or the vein of good intentions and really wreaking havoc. And I'll give you just one quick vignette. Dr. Susana Alvear, who's our medical director in Quito, Ecuador, laughed with me when I was visiting her 2 years ago and said, these patients will come in, her primary care patients will come in with baggies full of unidentified pills that people coming in to volunteer in health brigades and health efforts in Latin America will dispense to them, often in broken Spanish, often unlabeled or expired or labeled in English. And the patients will literally put these pills in a bag and take them to their local doctor or community healthcare worker and ask if they should take them. So, we need to make sure we're nurturing the perspective of what's happening before we arrive and what's happening after we leave, and setting up programs that don't give false sense of accomplishment.
Thanks so much, Jess. And Lisa, what stood out to you most as you watched the video?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what Jess and Brandon have already shared. I guess all those things also stood out to me, but also I think what jumped out at me was that although Rangi acknowledges that our struggles as human connection, the videos seem to be really strongly questioning whether outsiders have any role at all, except perhaps funding in supporting the struggles, justice, and a better quality of life of people in other communities. And, you saw that the students say, well, I had to go to Guatemala, but in what world does it make sense for me to go and do a service project? A valid question, but at the same time, I think, what was the project? What was that experience in the community? How was that set up? I think the role of an outsider really deserves careful consideration. I think it's pretty easy to fall trap of you're going to go there and be a savior things in somebody else's community. And he has a real point that as an outsider, you don't have that perspective. You don't have an ability immediately to understand all the nuances and motivations, complexity of the situation that you've entered into. And so there's risks in oversimplifying, and yet there are also perhaps benefits that come out of this necessary oversimplification of issues that could be even full, and when they're appropriately paired with insider knowledge of the situation, in that sometimes being embedded in a situation that you've known your whole life and all the richness and complexity of it can be overwhelming. It can be paralyzing because you think these always been so, I can't change it, and you're very accepting, whereas an outsider might come in and maybe they don't appreciate everything that causes that situation to be what it is. But if you sit down and have a dialogue together, be helpful and motivational to have that insider-outsider dialogue that can bring a different perspective and combine ideas, in a new way, and kind of catalyze new thinking at the community level. So it's one of those, yes, there has to be great care taken, but at the same time, it's not necessarily that the outsider has no role to play. It's finding the appropriate role. And then I guess in answer to the question raised in the film about who benefits from this, I think it's a valid question that we try to get every group and every individual that's connected with Foundation for Sustainable Development to think about and to ask themselves about. What we see is that most of the time, if people are in the right frame of mind, which is the one that I think Brandon and Jess have already, adequately described, the answer is both. That community activists can benefit from fresh perspective and energy and moral support for them and their cause, and the volunteers learn valuable skills about community building and tend to return to see their own communities in a new light and see their role in their community in a light. At least that's the feedback that we tend to get. To Eric's point, it depends on how those experiences are set up.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm seeing questions start to come in, which is awesome. I'm trying not to get distracted by reading the comments, but keep them coming. Just briefly, as we start to transition to more questions from the participants, we hear in the video this question of why you do what you do, why the motivations behind, and I hear that coming through in some of what you all are talking about as well. So can you, somewhat briefly, if we can, but this is a big topic, share either why you personally or why you as an organization do what you do? What is the why behind this work, both individually and organizationally, to transition us then into a little bit more dialogue? So do we want to go through the same old order, I guess? Brandon, can you start us off?
Sounds great, yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, as I mentioned before, our organization has evolved into what we call a fair trade learning organization, or at least we're trying to become that. And so in some ways, we do what we do because we're trying to combat some of the problems or concerns that show up in this video. Traveling to a new community, engaging with a new community, and making strong bonds in a new community is sort of the point of our organization, right? So we find that service just happens to be a great window into doing these things, or at least it's far better than, say, the alternatives, which are going on a safari or taking a picture out of a bus tour or getting cultured in Europe or staying in a resort or virtually meeting someone over the internet, which are, again, too often times the only other options for these types of cross-border engagements. Now, I should probably say that our brand of service might be a little bit different than what Mr. Wange is thinking of in terms of help. We take a pretty liberal view of service. In the Navajo Nation, for example, our service is simply listening. Our friends there have been colonized and conquered for hundreds of years, and the last thing they need are outsiders helping them. So our friends there, sort of at the end of the day, we believe as long as we're honest with our community partners and our visitors about what types of outcomes are reasonable and possible through collaboration, we can be effective for all parties. Secondly, I'd say that we definitely agree with a lot of what Mr. Wange is saying. However, we think that we can challenge these conventional narratives as well. And I think that's why we're probably all here. Specifically, as I mentioned, through fair trade learning initiatives, which value transparency, reciprocity, and community voice as a vital part of all engagement, we've tried to reframe the idea of international volunteering. So right now, I want to try a little exercise. You close your eyes, everyone close your eyes, and I might be able to see some of you closing your eyes, right? Okay, everyone's eyes. Oh no, Nathan, there you go. Lisa, eyes closed, perfect. Okay, now think about an international volunteer. What is the image that you have? Very likely that image is a white woman in a far out land. And I think that's very much what some of these critiques are coming from. But more and more, through some of these fair trade learning ideals, we're starting to work, we're starting to flip the script on this, and we're working to engage Brazilians in Pittsburgh or Bolivians in West Virginia. We work with Pakistanis in Ghana and Northern Irish in Washington, D.C. It's very powerful, actually. I would say that there's this idea that, like, I'll send money rather than volunteer internationally or serve internationally. But the reality is that, at least for our constituents, that just won't happen, or it hasn't happened unless there's some sort of connection or engagement. Our programs are designed to be a spark for both visitors and hosts, and to create lifelong advocates, and that's what we find oftentimes happens. And that's probably sort of ultimately what we can create. That's more important than anything: strong networks and strong bonds, and folks more equipped and passionate about helping both in their own communities and others. And I'll give you some real quick concrete example here. Our friends in Jamaica now know that if a hurricane destroys their small community, they've got about 1,000 advocates ready to raise funds, get dirty, and help rebuild. Our friends in Northern Ireland know that if violence gets out of hand in Belfast, they've got hundreds of advocates on campuses all over the world ready to stand up and sort of demand peace. And finally, if something happens here right down the street in the Hill District part of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a place that has been quite isolated for several years, our friends there know that we've got hundreds of advocates all over the world sort of ready to fight with them in solidarity. And simply put, these connections and these folks wouldn't exist otherwise. And so the image that Mr. Mwangi paints of international volunteers is definitely oftentimes true. And there's so many things that resonate with our organization, but it doesn't have to be true. And that's what we're trying to rethink and really challenge.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Jess, do you want to kind of continue this line of discussion? And before we transition to Jess, I'm seeing some comments come in, but if folks have specific questions too, this is the time we can kind of transition to that. So please send those along as we listen. Jess?
Thanks. Well, I'll reflect on both the personal and the organizational level as to the motivations. On a personal note, I, as a first-year med student, was actually involved in a health program abroad in Kenya, and had the unfortunate experience of saying yes when asked to do a lumbar puncture on a 7-year-old child with likely cerebral malaria. And I inserted a needle into the spine of the 7-year-old child while he was held down, defecating on himself and screaming. And I did that while there was a perfectly qualified local physician sitting next to me. I had seen lumbar punctures and I was a medical student, but I was in no way the appropriate person to be doing that. And I tell you that story because this is happening on a daily basis, and I don't care if it's a lumbar puncture or a vaccine or a deworming medication or an antihypertensive medication. It's wrong, and your universities are enabling this to happen, and my colleagues in medicine are enabling this to happen. And as a culture, we are exporting ourselves as a solution to a problem that we are only making worse, and the opportunity costs of doing that are not acceptable to me. So on a personal note, I do this because I don't want students to go with well-intended programs that are not teaching them how to say no thank you, or are putting them in clinical situations or having them set up clinical situations that are not an appropriate setting for their level of expertise or lack thereof. As an organization, CFHI has been doing this for almost 25 years, so it predated me. But I think it's really important, and CFHI is motivated by the fact that there's not many of us in the global north who are elevating the local narrative and allowing the local narrative to tell its own story. And also to really question and to walk the talk of what education we're providing. There are many multinational efforts to address the human resources for health crisis in this world, and none of them involve your students or CFHI participants being that solution. So CFHI is motivated by the fact that we love our partners and we think they are amazing experts of their own reality and the solution, the sustainable long-term solution to global health crises and inequities. Is there a role for our students in the future when they are professionals? Are we impacting the direction that they choose to go in, whether they choose to be dedicated to social justice at home and abroad? Do we influence how they vote through the subsequent 40 to 60 years of their life? Do we influence who they give their money to when they have money? I think we probably do. So we exist to nurture those qualities in humans, but to not preempt expertise and to set up learning experiences and cultural immersion experiences that provide learning what reality actually is.
Thank you for sharing, Jess. And I see comments coming in saying thank you so much for sharing transparently some of our own kind of individual and personal struggles and misgivings with some of this work, which often can be some of the motivation too. Lisa, can you share a little bit about the why of what you do, either personally or from the perspective of Foundation for Sustainable Development? What is the motivation to be involved in this work?
Sure. Well, I think just speaking to kind of my first exposure to this particular kind of work was in college, and it was a 4-week trip to Nicaragua. And it was fairly classic, service trip where there was a little health. We were supporting doctors at a home. We were building a school, and we were doing some water treatment. I don't know, like a whole grab bag of stuff, right, that was taking place. I had been involved in community service previously. In fact, the school had a really ethos of community service. So like 80% of students participate just in voluntary service anyway. And so the chance to do it abroad was actually super competitive, and I thought it'd be an awesome experience. And I came back pretty disappointed, actually, and kind of felt like there wasn't much development getting done. I'm not sure we added any value. All these questions that kind of come up, I think, when they're involved in this work. There were some nods to sustainability and how the projects were set up, but, did we add value? Probably not a lot. I went on to grad schools on international development because I really wanted to get development done. I wanted to see progress in improving people's quality of life in a sustainable way. So I spent 15 years basically working on capacity building of local community organizations, trying to help them figure out how to expand and improve the services that they're offering in their communities. And what was interesting to me as my career progressed was that the thing that kind of struck me was I found myself thinking back to that experience that I had in Nicaragua in my teens and 20s, and found that I kept learning from that experience over a good 10 years probably in my career. I had it. In spite of the fact I was disappointed by it, I kept going back and mining that experience to inform my values and the approaches that I was using in my career. And so when I heard about Foundation for Sustainable Development, I was first skeptical, and then I looked at it and said, now this organization is actually committed to supporting meaningful community-led development through volunteers. Wouldn't it be cool if people could learn like I've continued to learn from this experience, but that the community could actually also benefit. And then we could get real development done. And I felt like that was a really unique opportunity. And I took a pretty critical eye to what Steve was doing. And I found that the focus of the organization is really on the principles of mutual benefit and building from assets. and about empowering local communities and build skills and their confidence. I think we underestimate, to kind of Brandon's point, the value of solidarity across countries, across these, that there are people joining with you in the struggle and value what you're doing in your community. Sometimes, a prophet in their own land is not really well respected. And I think knowing that people come all the way from Pittsburgh or wherever and sit there with you and listen to you and what you're doing, and it can be very encouraging to activists. So I think that's something that we do that's maybe not the focus of our programming, but it is really valuable. And I feel like at the same time that we're building skills in the local community, we're building skills and confidence of students and professionals in the US who want to make a difference. And we're taking that energy and that good intention, and we're trying to shift it toward best possible way to support local efforts. And it's like, if you want to help, like, here are the things that you can do to help. And I think that positive energy is really a very powerful asset and shouldn't be wasted. And the question is really how to do it ethically. So we love working with universities that have a long-term relationship with the students, informing their thinking about ethical service and their role in the community. And we have a long-term relationship with the community organizations. And so if you put those two things together, you put good programming around really working with building the frame of mind there to support local initiatives, and teaching skills that are transferable to the volunteers' home community. I think you have the community that they're volunteering in benefiting, but also have those skills can be applied at home. Asset mapping, needs assessment, proposal writing, evaluation, project planning, budgeting, all these things. If the students that go and work with us learn those things and transfer those things to their home communities and bring them back, I think that's really valuable. So that's kind of why we do what we do.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm seeing some of the questions come in, but I'm also looking at the time. I see some questions.
Sure, could I just jump in with a little bit of
absolutely.
To make sure that everyone's aware, we will absolutely be, I see some questions that point toward what resources are already out there. And when we post this video, we'll make sure to link to the CoLove, which is how, as I understand it, that Irish NGO that Philip works for is pronounced, their code of standards, along with the work that's come out of the University of Minnesota, supporting a lot of what Jess has referred to for health in particular, and the fair trade learning standards. Gonzalo's just mentioning the chapters coming out. So we, thanks, Philip. So we will make sure that we're linking to all these resources that exist, and appreciate everyone reaching out for that. I was wondering if we could turn in the time that we have remaining, that there are resources is important. And at the same time, sometimes we need to see more coalition building before we can get people to really listen to those resources. So I was wondering if those who are on the call, we might go back to Patrick's question from some time ago that related to how do we make sure that universities and others are doing best practice work, or how do we spread the word about this? What would you look for? And I'll be quiet here in a moment, but I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. The direction of your questions and the content of them really reveal to the several of us who have been working together now for some years that there are many like-minded people. What we hope to do is to continue to grow these relationships and coalitions as we move forward. So any one of you might begin with what you'd look for advocacy or partnership or awareness raising in this area.
I think, if I might just chime in, I think you have to be really strategic about this, and I'll give you an example. So when you ask me what universities will listen to, immediately in my mind I'm thinking they'll respond to risk, they'll respond to threats to their reputation, they'll respond to lawsuits, and they'll respond to money. And that might seem cynical, but that isn't very much reality. And so I think we, as a community of like-minded practitioners need to think about our sphere of influence as well as the mechanisms for influence. I'll give you an example of how we're doing this in health-related settings. You know, I was talking about ethics the last 15 years or so. I'm older than I look. And one day, an advisor at University of Michigan pulled me aside after a talk and said, you know, I agree with everything you're saying, but as long as students think it will help them get into medical school to practice on patients in low and middle income countries around the world, she says, everything we say to them is not going to matter. And I was, you know, it was this light bulb went off, and I said, that's so true. So I'm a physician, I'm in medical education. So I decided, you know, one of my spheres of influence is informing the admissions process to medical school, because I'm going to talk till I'm blue in the face and I'm going to be way wrinklier and nothing's going to have changed unless the admissions committees change how they're looking at international experiences, whether they scrutinize them more, and whether it becomes faux pas, as it should be, to practice medicine as an undergraduate student on poor patients, whether it's in our backyard or across the world, I don't care. And so the GASP group was formed, and that's exactly what we're doing, is connecting the dots. So admissions committees are informed with how they're talking about these things and what they're rewarding and not rewarding, so that students will then respond to that, because that tends to be a big motivator in the health-related sector.
Another motivator I might just jump in and add is the I have heard from, I won't mention the name of the institution because I'm not sure if they would prefer that or not, but an elite institution has recently adopted using some of the fair trade learning standards in their program development with their faculty. And their rationale actually drove, in large part, they were quite interested in the ethics of it, but a large part of their rationale drove from their realization that students would have deeper connected experiences with community organizations and with development public health, the kinds of things they're interested in studying, if those components of the community partnership were done in robust ways. So they've been getting a lot of feedback from students that they didn't feel deeply connected, and this was a mechanism to improve the student experience, which also improves the ethical components of the community partnership.
That's great to hear.
I'd like to mention a quick elephant in the room that always pops up when we start to talk about coalition building or how do we bring all sorts of people into the mix. And that's just the cost behind this. So right now Amizade is going through a strategic planning process, and we never get to do this. We're actually evaluating all of our education partners. We're used to getting graded. We don't ever get to grade other universities we work with. And it's been a great exercise, but we're looking at a couple of different criteria. Two of these criteria focus on ethics, and there's a sort of a clear pattern that it's very difficult for low-income schools or community colleges to invest money, because this takes money, this takes time. Their needs are very different than, say, some of these larger institutions that are well funded for this type of work, and so it becomes really challenging, I think. Whenever a faculty member can't even, we have one faculty member right now that has chosen not to take a salary on a program, which we do not advise as an idea here, but in an attempt to make sure that there's some sort of reciprocity happening. That's a dangerous recipe when you have some institutions that have over $100 million for this type of work, and the vast majority of them, sort of can't even get their mind wrapped around how do we even recruit students for an experience like this?
I think that value alignment spoke very well to a number of people, and we will have to end here. I want to be sure that we have fidelity to what we promised people in terms of a 1-hour session. The good news, I think, is that there seems to be a lot of energy and interest. Nora, anything you'd like to add for closing?
Just looping back to the logistical, I know Eric will be sending out to everyone who registered for the webinar an opportunity to give feedback. We very much welcome the feedback. We're learning not only the best way to do this, but what is most useful to this community and field building. So please share feedback. And in that email, I'm assuming, Eric, will be some of the details around the second webinar that will be coming up October 16th. So hopefully we can continue this conversation over time, and hope to see many of you joining us there. I would just thank our presenters for all being here today and taking the time to join us, and then thank all the participants for joining us as well. We look forward to continuing the conversation and hearing more as we move forward.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you, Nora.